O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister statement. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, the social fabric of a small community is one of its strengths. Close family ties and a strong sense of community belonging are enduring characteristics and cannot be understated when residents make important life choices, further employment, education, and skills training. This government made a commitment to support small communities by developing and implementing a strategy to increase training and employment in all communities. This is part of our mandate to enhance the Small Community Employment Support Program and develop and implement a strategy to increase employment and training in small communities that guides the delivery of territorial programming. Last year, interim changes to benefit levels and greater flexibility were implemented to the existing Small Community Employment Support Program, and between April 1st and December 31st, 2017, the creation of nearly 400 jobs were supported under this program, while Education, Culture, and Employment developed a strategy to ensure the right mix of programs and supports are available to serve small communities. Mr. Speaker, the Small Community Employment Strategy is on schedule, and we intend to release it later this spring. In developing the strategy, Education, Culture, and Employment conducted engagements that invited individuals, employers, community organizations, and other participants from across the Northwest Territories to share ideas, provide input, discuss issues, and suggest ways to support employment and training in small communities. There was an additional online survey posted to incorporate feedback from those that could not attend the in-person sessions. In total, input from 411 stakeholders from 31 communities informed the strategy. A first of its kind, Mr. Speaker, the forthcoming Small Community Employment Strategy outlines how the government of the Northwest Territories will enhance employment and training opportunities and outcomes in our smallest communities. The strategy recognizes the need to support the foundational aspects of employment and employability, as well as program delivery. It will consist of programming, supports, and services that extend beyond the scope of the existing Small Community Employment Support Program. Mr. Speaker, we have learned from all of our partners across government, business, and industry, and built on the work that has been completed to date. Over the next 6 years, this strategy will direct our work with the vision that Northwest Territories residents in all small communities have the knowledge, skills, and attitudes for employment success. The strategy includes 4 goals that mirror those of our Skills for Success strategy and includes increasing skill levels, bridging education and employment gaps, growing the Northwest Territories workforce, and improving decision-making with relevant labour market information. We remain focused on creating training and job opportunities in small communities. I would like to thank all of the people that took the time to attend the engagements and respond to the survey. I would also like to acknowledge the contribution from the Committee of Rural and Remote Communities. The input we received across the territory was invaluable and has informed a small community employment strategy built by Northerners for the North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statements. Minister Ike Goodman, the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, our government has committed in the mandate to diversify the economy to create greater opportunities for our residents. Our investment in agricultural sector is part of this important work, and we continue to make progress on this commitment. Mr. Speaker, today is Canada's Agriculture Day. It is a day established to increase awareness for and encourage the relationship between food consumers and food producers, a relationship that we as a government are growing in our territory in support of our mandate to increase economic development and diversification and stabilize the cost of living in our communities. For the first time this year, we are joining the Canadian farmers, harvesters, growers, and all of those who enjoy their products in marking this day. It is a milestone that also highlights our transition to a more commercially focused agriculture sector. With the new fiscal year, we will open a new chapter in our economy as we invest new money into the implementation of our agriculture strategy and its goal to advance the business of food in the Northwest Territories. Meanwhile, we are finalizing our participation in the new Canadian Agriculture Partnership, which will build on the Growing Forward programs that preceded it, to sustain an annual investment of $1.2 million in the regional and community agriculture activities that have got us to where we are today. While our first areas of the strategy implementation must be in the process of regulatory frameworks that will guide and protect our commercial food sector, the Canadian Agriculture Partnership will allow us to continue to support local agricultural training programs, courses, and workshops in areas such as greenhouse operations, new food growing techniques, food preservation, composting, and harvesting. Mr. Speaker, while the seeds of commercial agriculture sector in the N.W.T have been planted, its growth and success will depend on N.W.T growers and producers getting involved and embracing the potential that we have. I'm happy to advise, Mr. Speaker, that they are doing just that and more. Our territory boasts commercial agriculture operations that range from egg and honey production to hydroponics and vegetables and a wide range of small and larger livestock. We have businesses that supply producers with seeds, local compost, feed, and other inputs. Every region has one or more commercial agriculture operations. People can shop for fresh produce at farmers markets in Inuvik, Norman Wells, Yellowknife, Hay River, Fort Smith, and Fort Simpson. After taking root in the Northwest Territories' first ever commercial food producers conference in Hay River last year, a new organization is being formalized to represent the interests of Northwest Territories growers and producers. Mr. Speaker, as we celebrate Canada's Agriculture Day, it is my pleasure to salute the hardworking individuals in our territory who are dedicated to growing fresh, nutritious food across the Northwest Territories. Our local food producers are not only leaders within their communities, they are forging a new economic path for our territory. We have made great strides in the advancement of our agriculture sector and will continue our investment and support for growers, initiatives, and commercial entities that will help us realize the viability and potential of this important sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister, you can go down in the Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise members that the Honourable Glenn Abernathy will be late arriving in the House today due to a personal matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Tomorrow's Valentine's Day, and I'm starting to get that feeling. I love mining, as long as it is done properly, as long as it is properly managed, we get our fair share. Unfortunately, that's not what we got yesterday from the Minister of Mining when he tabled the What We Heard report on the Mineral Resources Act. Rather than a good summary of what was submitted, it's a classic example of regulatory capture. Regulatory capture happens when a government agency created to act in the public interest instead advances the commercial concerns or interests of the industry or sector it is charged with regulating. Most of the input provided to ITI during its public engagement is boiled down into almost unintelligible bullets that do not provide any detail. ITI has not posted the written submissions. Rather than a good summary of what many stakeholders submitted, the What We Heard report seems to have been cherry-picked from submissions to suit the department's views as a promoter of mineral development. Many comments from stakeholders are categorized improperly, taken out of context, or the main points are not presented at all. Something as basic as moving the responsibility for mineral rights administration to the Department of Lands to avoid bias and conflict of interest is not even mentioned. No further information is provided on best practices or lessons learned from other jurisdictions, despite a promise by the Minister to do so on October the 19th in a public briefing to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. ITI's, quote, cross-jurisdictional reviews and extensive policy research, end of quote, should have easily allowed for this information to be made available to the public. There is no clear indication in the report whether there will be any further public engagement, as promised by the Minister at the public briefing and even yesterday here on the floor of this House. An ITI-commissioned international benchmarking study and other research shows N.W.T is not collecting enough revenue from mining. While I have gone on record as asking the department to take the time to get it right, delaying the review of royalties and taxation for mining will cost our territory literally tens of millions of dollars of lost revenue. No details on this royalty review are provided in the document, and it was very disappointing to hear the Minister say yesterday that this important work is not likely to take place during this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Members seeking unanimous consent to conclude the statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. As I said, it was disappointing to hear the Minister say yesterday that this important work is not likely to take place during this Assembly. Why did we bother to get devolution when something as fundamental as how much money the public gets from resource extraction is not going to be reviewed? Why should Ottawa give us any more authority when we won't even exercise what we have? Needless to say, Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions for the Mining Minister later today. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Goodden and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canada is taking steps to replace its Northern strategy with a new Arctic policy framework. As part of this work, Mary Simon, former ambassador to the Arctic Council and Minister Bennett's special representative, developed a new shared Arctic leadership model. In her report, Ms. Simon makes a series of recommendations for action in Canada's Arctic regions, including the Northwest Territories. I appreciate the recommendations, and I know that they were made after engagement and consultation, but there still seems to be some uncertainty around federal policies relating to northern development. This makes me wonder about the role our government has played to make sure that our priorities are taken into consideration for this Arctic policy framework. Mr. Speaker, in the spirit of devolution and respecting our existing comprehensive land rights agreements, as well as those currently being negotiated, the people of the N.W.T need to be in charge of our own future. We recognize that this will require collaboration and partnerships, and I appreciate the federal government working towards a vision for the Arctic. However, we cannot let Canada develop broad policies that affect us without ensuring that the priorities of our people are fully considered. The Premier has been clear on this message, and I agree with that position. Mr. Speaker, climate change is changing Arctic lands and waters irreversibly. Commercial shipping is becoming a reality through Northwest Passage. Our own Arctic communities are being visited by cruise ships. We have just completed the first road linking to the Arctic Ocean. Other nations, including China, Russia, and the United States, are all planning to have major presence in the Arctic. So what is our government doing to guarantee that our needs are met in the development of Canada's Arctic policy framework? Has the N.W.T. in fact even determined our needs and priorities with respect to the new framework? Are Indigenous governments in the N.W.T. able to have their say? Mr. Speaker, now is the time to effect change and address many of our pressing challenges. It is essential for our government to step up and demonstrate strong leadership when it comes to the Arctic policy framework. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Premier at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Goodden and the member Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On January 15th of last month, the City of Yellowknife reported a sewage spill in my constituency of Cam Lake. An estimated 1 million to 2 million litres of sewage was spilled, entering Cam Lake at two different locations, migrating from Cam Lake Road through drainage infrastructure and into the lots of several property owners, while the rest flowed downstream near the city garage. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the City of Yellowknife for their prompt action to clean up this sewage spill, quickly collecting liquid sewage from the ditches and transporting it out of Cam Lake for disposal. However, frozen sewage is a more difficult matter, and one of the excavators hired to complete the cleanup work near the city garage broke through the ice on Cam Lake, further complicating the cleanup effort. Mr. Speaker, this issue is about more than raw sewage, although I can't imagine a more unpleasant situation for homeowners to have to deal with. It's about ensuring the environmental health of our residents, and in particular, the residents that I represent in this House. It's important that we communicate clearly in an effective manner with the public on this spill and provide the confidence to my constituents that all levels of government are on the case working to ensure that neighborhoods are clean, healthy, and safe. That's why I'm pleased to report that tonight an open house will be held at Yellowknife City Hall, and I urge all those affected and other interested parties to join me at this public information event. I applaud the city for also taking the lead in ensuring that this cleanup is being done in a transparent and open manner. Although we are well into the month of February, there is still much more work to be done to ensure this spill is taken care of, and given the overlapping mandates of various governments on environmental protection, this cleanup is not solely the responsibility of the City of Yellowknife alone to resolve. The Department of Environment, Natural Resources is responsible for the Government of the Northwest Territories' response to the sewage spill, and I will have questions to the Minister responsible on the role of the Department in assisting the City to restore the environmental health of my constituency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodman and the member Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Power outages are all too common in our smallest communities, which generally depend on a diesel plant to generate electricity. In Kakiza, loss of electrical power has caused frozen pipes and septic lines and other difficulties. In fact, Kakiza does not even have a generator. Its power comes from the Doy Point generator, operated by Northland Utilities near the Mackenzie River. And Northland itself is a small division of a big Alberta company. Some power outages are caused by the weight of accumulated snow on power lines. Some are caused by unexpected spikes in power consumption. Sometimes it takes a while to find the cause. Kakiza does not use a lot of power, but it is still very important to the community's residents. For example, when electricity is lost for an extended period, elders who rely on furnaces to heat their homes sometimes have to leave or find some place where there's a wood stove. Leaving your home unattended for even a day can result in frozen water lines, and that has happened. Mr. Speaker, as small as it is, Kakiza could become a model to showcase renewable energy projects and sustainability. The community worked with the Arctic Energy Alliance on a very basic community energy plan completed in 2010. Since then, the community has discussed a number of ideas, but it is not easy to find help and then money to turn the best ideas into reality. Maybe a central heating system fueled by wood pellets could supply the entire community. Perhaps the power line could be extended from Hay River, linking Kakiza to the Tulsan River grid. Or a local mini hydro system might be built to supply the community's needs. Maybe the solution to frequent outages is as simple as a portable backup generator for each household. The problem is, it seems to be no one's job to study these opportunities and come up with a working solution. Once again, I wonder, why doesn't the government help the small communities? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodman and the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, living wage calculations have been undertaken across the country, including here in Yellowknife. The premise of the living wage is that no one who's working full-time should be living in poverty. Yet many do. Tax filer data says that 1 in 3 single-parent families and 1 in 8 two-parent families don't earn enough money to meet their most basic needs. The living wage is calculated for the most common family type. That's 2 parents who work full-time with 1 child in school and 1 in licensed childcare. It won't surprise anyone that this family's biggest expense is rent. Close behind is the cost of childcare at almost $16,000 a year for full-time care for 1 child and after-school care for the other. The cost of food rounds out the list of top 3 expenses. Mr. Speaker, the living wage calculated for Yellowknife is $22.24 an hour. That's a useful measure of the cost of living here. The wage has increased by $1.56 an hour since 2015, driven by a 5% cost increase in rent and 5% in childcare and 6% in food in the last 2 years. The living wage calculation takes into account government benefits and transfers. The revamped N.W.T child benefit netted the family of four only $14 a year. The family was over the income threshold for the Housing Corporation's rent supplement program and had difficulty accessing a child care subsidy. Income thresholds are too low for these programs to allow low-income families to benefit from them. Employers who voluntarily pay the living wage see the benefits, including attracting and keeping qualified staff and increasing productivity. My hope is that more employers will consider joining this initiative. Government has a role to play too, by increasing the income threshold for programs that takes into account the cost of living and by indexing benefits to inflation. Mr. Speaker, the importance of paying a living wage is that it offers a systemic response to poverty. A living wage enables families to meet their basic needs without the help of public housing and food banks. It enables them to be independent and to experience the satisfaction that comes with that. I will have questions for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godanende, Member Tunade Wolode.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today my member statement is about doctors in the N.W.T healthcare system. Currently, only 45% of N.W.T residents have a regular doctor, which means that just over half the population goes from one doctor to another as they try to address their own personal health issues. The rest of Canada does not face the same issue, as the national average sits at 83% according to the 2017 Statistics Canada report. Mr. Speaker, the department started working on creating a territorial pool of doctors that would lessen the use of locum doctors. But today it seems as though we are no further along than we were when we started. Mr. Speaker, our residents are lacking medical consistency, which leaves them vulnerable to shorter life expectancy, higher infant mortality rates, fewer opportunities for cancer screening. Due to the lack of access to and long-term relationships with health professionals, our residents are getting less medical service than what is normal in the rest of Canada. Mr. Speaker, the idea of having our doctors living and practicing in the N.W.T is very exciting and would have positive impact on the health of our residents, not to mention the benefits it would have in our economy and our housing markets. Mr. Speaker, I give one example. Let's say that the new Hay River Health Centre has a full complement of 6 doctors, but could only find 3 doctors willing to live in Hay River. Under the territorial pool, the system could hire 6 doctors that would live in Yellowknife, and they would practice half-time at the new Stanton Hospital and practice half-time in Hay River. Mr. Speaker, another bonus of such scenario would be patients from Hay River, if referred to Yellowknife, would have a very good chance of seeing their own regular doctor here at Stanton. Mr. Speaker, the government needs to hire more doctors to live in the north. With a lack of full-time doctors, I believe doctors are facing challenges with heavy workloads. I urge the Minister of Health to engage with the N.W.T Medical Association on working on a strategic plan to attract physicians to move to the north. Mr. Speaker, we need to address this issue and work towards recruiting and retaining doctors for the north. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I regret to inform the House that early Sunday morning on November 19th in Nanaimo, BC, Doris McPherson passed away after a long battle with her sickness. Her son, daughter-in-law, and grandson were by her bedside as she passed away in her sleep. Doris was born on September 30th, 1946 to Lucy and George McPherson in Fort Simpson. Doris enjoyed her life to the fullest and always had a smile and a good word for everybody that she met. Doris had adored her 2 children, Daryl and Nikki, and her grandson Brendan. When she came home, she made her time for her loving sisters, brothers, nieces, nephews, and extended family first and foremost. She always loved coming home and was planning on moving back. In early 1960s, Doris moved to Yellowknife to work with the Commissioner of the N.W.T. Yes, she worked for Stu Hutchinson, and I have seen a copy of her ID with his signature on it. She was very proud to have been given that opportunity to work with him. In 1975, Doris and her son Darrell left the N.W.T. for a job in Nanaimo, BC with the federal government in the social work field. In 1980, she met her late husband, George DeRouche. Together, they traveled all over Canada and the U.S. When you talked to her about her husband and their travels, it was amazing to hear about all their adventures together. As Doris had said to her family, the years she spent with her husband were truly her happiest and most loving time in her life. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2004. When people spoke about Doris, they would say that she was the light in everyone's life. She was generous, kind, and known for her sense of humor, and could always be seen dancing. The community of Fort Simpson and the family had a memorial service for her on Friday, December 1st at the Rec Center. The service was well attended, and on Tuesday, June 21st, she will have her ashes buried on her mother's grave in Fort Simpson. She will be sadly missed by all.
I see. Our condolences to the family as well. Member statements. Member statements. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize a long-term friend. We grew up together in Hay River. He now lives in Yellowknife, Sean Ivan. Welcome to the Legislative Assembly.
Let's see. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. I'd like to also welcome Sean Ivans, entrepreneur of the North. Thanks for being here with us. Mercy. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned in my member statement earlier today, normally I like to share good news stories about my riding, but unfortunately we had a rather large sewage spill. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources what actions the department, or what role the department has played in assisting the City of Yellowknife in cleaning up this awful mess. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that they had called the spill line, and Ian, our officers, went to the site. Ian, we're the lead regulatory agency that ensures the responsible parties, like the city, remediation operations. They meet departmental standards for the protection of people, property, and management. So our officers were on the scene right away. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nakita Cassie, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, are there any concerns arising from the regulatory side related to the spill? Has it been well contained by the city? Are there any lasting environmental hazards to my constituents and in particular property owners in Cam Lake? Thank you.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my understanding the city responded very well to the site. They cleaned it up right away. They had a vacuum truck on site and transported the sewage that was spilled. And unfortunately, the excavator that they were using also went through the ice. But our department reports that there was no petroleum contamination on site, and they continue to work with the city to ensure that the site is well taken care of. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadadea, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for his answer and for the action the department has taken. Tonight there is a public town hall. Will personnel from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources be on hand to answer any questions members of the public might have as it relates to this bill? Thank you.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Mr. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will check with the department. I will give direction to the department to ensure that we have staff on hand to answer any questions that may come up during the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. The member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, throughout my term as an MLA from Nehende, we've heard about this great project at Colville Lake and with the solar and that there. So I have some questions for the minister responsible for the Power Corp. In regards to the project in Colville Lake, who was involved and helped fund this pilot project? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for N.W.T. Power Corp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government of the Northwest Territories provided $1,150,000 for the hybrid solar photovoltaic diesel and battery energy power plant project in Colville Lake. The federal government also contributed money in the amount of $150,000. So total government contributions amounted to $1.3 million. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for his answer. In regards to this project, and it's a pilot project from my understanding from the different briefings I've received from the department or the Power Corp, and can the minister tell us how long this pilot project is scheduled to last? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for N.W.T. Power Corp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can advise that monitoring will continue over the entire life of the project. Our experience with this type of project is that what we learn from the project can be used and applied to future projects under the energy strategy. Solar panels have a life of 25 years or more, but batteries have a lesser life of about 10 years. So battery technology, however, is improving, so that may enhance the project. Thank you.
Oral question. Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer. It's good to hear that the corporation is learning as they move on for other projects. So can the minister please advise us what has the Power Corp learned from this project and how that we can move forward with it? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for N.W.T. Power Corp.
The goal of the project was to validate the integration of solar with significant storage capacity and test the limits of integrating intermittent renewable energy sources. And TPC has contracted with a third party to complete a performance review of the hybrid plant at Colville Lake to be completed at the end of March 2018. Once the study is complete, a design basis for a standard energy storage system will be completed for consideration in other NTPC thermal power plants. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to, give some credit to the Power Corp, because when the solar panels that is worked in there, you can hear a pin drop in the community. It's that quiet, so it's very positive in that nature. When can we see the Power Corp actually expand this project to other small communities such as Jean Marie or Kikisa? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for N.W.T. Power Corp.
Speaker, the Power Corporation supports the government's work on the 2030 energy strategy, is looking forward to become a key partner in implementing a 3-year action plan that is currently under development. We understand that emerging renewable energy projects require additional financial support, and the N.W.T. is committed to covering the incremental cost of these investments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. The report on the Mineral Resources Act public engagement exercise is what we believe document from ITI rather than what was said. Can the minister explain why he promised that there would be more information made available from ITI's, quote, cross-jurisdictional reviews and extensive policy research, end of quote, in this report, yet there's nothing on that subject in the document? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've moved into the legislative drafting process on the MRA, the Mineral Resources Act. What we heard during the public engagement, along with consideration of other key elements, the resulting of the scoping exercise across jurisdictional review and policy research, that's what we take now and is going to guide us to help us develop the Mineral Resource Act. Because that specifically may not have been in what we heard report doesn't mean that we haven't taken those things into consideration. Our policy rationale for the proposed act will be provided to SCEDI as part of our legislative process, and when we get there we can explain that. But as we enter the next phase of the legislative development, we are talking about the necessary steps to ensure the role of standing committee and cabinet as legislators are not fettered. So we need to continue moving this forward, and we need to be able to carry out the drafting and policy development moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, Cassie Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that response, but he promised to give more information on how this is dealt with in other jurisdictions in the report. It's not there. On October the 19th, when he did appear before the Standing Committee, he promised there would be targeted public engagement on this report. And yesterday, he repeated that promise in the House. Can the Minister explain what this targeted engagement is and who's going to be consulted and when? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The public engagement plan was provided to SCEDI and stated that the second round of engagement could occur based on the expression of interest of community and feedback that we have with. In fact, this is already happening, Mr. Speaker. We've already met with the Chamber of Mines, and we've received a request to meet with Alternatives North and expect to meet with them also moving forward. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. And we will also continue to meet with the Intergovernmental Council going forward with the drafting process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada, Cassie Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, and thanks again to the Minister for that. Unfortunately, the what we heard report doesn't even invite any further comments or public engagement. So glad to hear it's happening, though. It might just be advertised a little bit better. In the House yesterday, the Minister said that a review on mining revenues would not likely take place during this Assembly. And it's my view, ITI cannot be left in charge of this review due to its conflict of interest as mining promoter and the obvious regulatory capture that's taken place. Many other jurisdictions like Alberta have conducted independent reviews of economic rent from non-renewable resources. Will the Minister commit to an independent, evidence-based review of economic rent from mining, including taxes and royalties, during the life of this Assembly? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, the member knows he's asking a question that can't be answered. How can we know what we're losing out on if we don't know what the royalty regime will be in the future? We know that as in the interim, the mines will continue to provide jobs for residents of Northwest Territories, business opportunities. They will continue to pay their fees and maintain their mineral tender, pay their land tenure fees, royalties, property taxes, payroll taxes, and corporate taxes, as well as abiding by the social economic agreements and the IBAs that they've signed into. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Cassie Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I don't think I actually heard a response to my question, so I'll try it again. I think he's leapt ahead to my the next one that I was going to ask, but I was looking for a commitment from the Minister to an independent, evidence-based review of economic rent from mining, including taxes and royalties, during the life of this Assembly. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've stated in the House yesterday, we're not prepared to do that in the life of this Assembly. In our discussions with the Intergovernmental Council, we have made the decision to park this review of royalties moving forward until such time as the MRA is done, and we will continue to move towards that. But when we do come forward with the mineral resource royalties review, I can assure this House that we will have meaningful participation, no different than what we've done on the MRA. We'll have reach out to all the regions, all the stakeholders, all the residents of the Northwest Territories, online, in person, what we need to do to make sure we get this Mineral Resource Act right and the royalties moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Hikada County, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier I was talking about the Arctic Policy Framework and that the federal government is replacing the Northern Strategy with a new Arctic Policy Framework. And so my questions today are for the Premier. And while I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, that there is work being done, I'm a little bit concerned that the framework doesn't really align or isn't balanced with the territory's goal and objectives. And so I would like to start by asking the Premier, can the Premier first of all tell Northerners what our government is doing to guarantee that our needs are being met in the development of the Arctic Policy Framework? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, the Arctic Policy Framework is a federal policy, so there are no guarantees because it'll be developed by the federal government. Having said that, the federal government has seen fit to include in their definition of Arctic to include not only Yukon, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories, but have also included Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec, Manitoba, and of course the Assembly of First Nation, Inuit, Pirsat, Kanatami, and the Métis National Council. So, as I said, this is a federal government. Nonetheless, we are working very hard to include all sectors, all stakeholders, all governments in developing a Northwest Territories chapter. There will be, obviously, the federal government will have the overarching document. There will be chapters for N.W.T, Nunavut, Yukon. There will be chapters for the 3 provinces. There will be chapters for AFN, ITK, and MNC. So we are holding roundtables to ensure that we get as much input as possible. And the only guarantee, I wouldn't say it's a guarantee, I wrote to the Prime Minister and he wrote back that he welcomed our input, that we will have our own N.W.T chapter, and if we didn't like what was written in the draft, he would be pleased to meet to talk about how we could improve the policy framework for the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akita Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Premier for the detailed that he shared in the reply. But just for a little bit of clarification, I'd like to ask the Premier, I recognize that we're undergoing efforts on our part to make a contribution to the chapter in the Arctic Policy Framework. I just want to get confirmation again from the Premier that are we consulting with Indigenous governments here in our territory for a contribution to that chapter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as part of the overall framework, our government has the opportunity to develop a chapter, and we have begun that process with a series of roundtables with Indigenous governments, industry, and non-government organizations to identify key issues to include in the N.W.T chapter. And I should point out that Indigenous governments certainly have other opportunities. Inuit can have input into the ITK chapter. They have alliances with Nunavut, so they could have input in the Nunavut chapter. The federal government is holding parallel roundtables throughout the north with the same people, so they'll be very well represented. They'll have a lot of input into this document. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks again to the Minister to the Premier for his reply. Last year at Roundup, not the most recent one, but the one before, the Premier, along with our sister territories, announced the Pan-Territorial Vision for Sustainable Development. Is it the Premier's position that The Government of the Northwest Territories, a significant part of our chapter in the Arctic Policy Framework, will stem from the Pan-Territorial Vision for Sustainable Development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs Canada appointed a ministerial special representative to consult across northern Canada about the Arctic Policy Framework. Mary Simon was the MSR, and the three northern premiers felt that her report was too focused on conservation. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find the word sustainable development any place in that report. And so we felt that we needed to have some balance, so the three premiers of the three northern territories developed a pan-territorial vision for sustainable development that we submitted it to the Prime Minister, and that is one aspect of it. In writing the chapter, we will be, as I said, we will be consulting across the territory, and this will be a portion of and would provide input into the development of the Northwest Territories chapter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, no Dede Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Premier's reply. There has been some concerns, I suppose, that have been raised about the Pan-Territorial Vision for Sustainable Development, in the sense that some folks are concerned about the balance that it might have within itself. And I just wanted to ask the Premier, as much as it does focus on economic development, and frankly I agree that that is a focus that we need to have, does the Premier feel that our goals to diversify the economy, mitigate climate change, and educate our people will also be met within the Pan-Territorial Vision for Sustainable Development? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We support balanced, sustainable development, and we believe that with the Pan-Territorial Vision for Sustainable Development, that at least in the Northwest Territories chapter, we will have some balance between conservation and development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, member Decho.
Mr. Speaker, I had to think long and hard about what minister is responsible for electricity in Kakisa. But when I dial E for energy, it is the Minister of Infrastructure who must answer the bell. I'll start by asking them, who is responsible for innovative solutions to Kakisa's electricity problems? Earlier, I alluded to the frequent power outages. And what funding is available for the necessary research? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you may know, Kakisa is one of the communities serviced by Northland Utilities, and we do, however, have Kakisa in particular on our radar. One exciting potential project is the Fort Providence to Kakisa transmission line to connect diesel communities to the Tulsan Renewable Hydro Project, and this proposed project is detailed in our draft energy strategy that's coming out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, Cassie, member Decho.
Mr. Speaker, it's very encouraging to hear from the Minister that Kakisa is indeed on the radar. What is the Department of Infrastructure doing to help small communities develop more reliable and more sustainable options for generating electricity, and then researching them for useful community energy plants? Will the Minister commit to working with Kakisa on that? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a slate of potential energy solutions for communities across the Northwest Territories, including wind, solar, LNG, mini hydro. This will depend on the local energy resources potential of each community. Under the Energy 2030 strategy, we are committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from diesel communities by 25% by 2030. Community energy plans are well suited for community-owned energy efficiency and renewable heating solutions. And under the energy strategy, we are committed to supporting energy planning for communities that take this initiative. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tada Dayakasi member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister's department has a lot of experience with pellet heating systems. Have his experts look at the feasibility of a community heating system for Kakiza, and if so, what was the result? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This would likely require some study. There's a lot of factors that go into understanding the type of system would be feasible in the community. Under the Energy Strategy Action Plan, the Government of Northwest Territories will be launching an application-based government energy fund where communities can request funds to undertake this kind of initiative. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Dayakasi member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that the needs of small communities lack detail and emphasis in developing energy strategy for the N.W.T. Will the Minister please explain how the territorial energy strategy will address the needs I have identified for Kakiza, for example, the frequent power outages, and I'm sure other communities as well? Merci.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 2030 energy strategy that we will be tabling, in fact, revolves around community needs. I think 5 out of the 6 points that we have in there are around communities and supporting communities and community residents. And the Government of Northwest Territories, as well as the Arctic Energy Alliance, are in line to well support communities when it comes to sustainable energy solutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. As I mentioned in my statement, the N.W.T. child benefit is not helpful to the low-income family of 4 that we surveyed for our living wage calculation. Their income, which is for the 2 of them for the year, $92,518, qualifies them for just $14 a year from the N.W.T. child benefit. But the intention of this benefit, the Minister told us, is to help working families with their expenses. So my question is, will the Minister revisit and revise the income threshold for the N.W.T. child benefit? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and as the member has mentioned, it's not only the N.W.T. child benefit that we made improvements to and changes to with our income assistance benefits that exempted income intended to help with the cost of raising children, but we also looked at the child support payments. That was on also further to the work that we did with the Canada child benefit, and we made changes there. I can ensure the member that any individuals and families in the Northwest Territories that are unable to meet their basic financial needs can also access assistance through JNWT social programming, and we offer those programs to the families. Seeing that this is still new, we're still going to have to look at doing the report and looking at monitoring this program moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akita Dayakasi member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his response, but I believe he's missed the point of the living wage. The point of the living wage is that people work full-time to take care of themselves and their families out of their employment income. They don't need food banks. They don't need public housing. They need to earn a decent wage so that they can pay their way. And so to that end, the N.W.T. child benefit could be very helpful to working families. And so that's the reason that I'm interested in knowing whether the Minister will look at revising the income threshold to make it more useful to low-income families. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member mentioned living wage. And the living wage reflects what earners need to bring home to live an acceptable quality of life. I just want to inform members and the public that there's no jurisdiction in Canada currently that has legislated a living wage as part of its minimum wage policy. As a government collectively, with housing, health, My department, Education, Culture, Employment, we do provide a lot of services to help low to modest income families, and we continue to look at doing those supports. As I mentioned, we're really in our first year of the N.W.T child benefit. I will go back to the department and have those discussions in terms of how the evaluation of the N.W.T child benefit was in its first year, and we haven't had a complete first year yet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tado Dayakasi, member, Yellowknife Center.
Speaker, I appreciate the minister's willingness to go back and look. For what it's worth, the income threshold is also too low for the Canada Child benefit. Mr. Speaker, the point of the living wage is not to ask government to legislate the living wage, but rather it's to encourage employers to see the benefits for themselves of paying a living wage in order to recruit and retain and encourage greater productivity from their workforce. So we are not looking for legislation of the living wage. I want to talk about how the cost of living has gone up in the last 2 years, 5% each for shelter and childcare, 6% for food. Is there any thought about indexing this benefit to inflation? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, and setting minimum wage to increase with inflation could limit our ability to explore other options for adjusting the minimum wage rate. We do have a minimum wage committee that does a lot of work on behalf of the government and brings back options. They do that every 2 years. As you know, N.W.T CPI rates are based on Yellowknife, and if there was any links to that, it would adversely affect some of our more northern and more isolated communities that do even have a higher cost of living if we looked at doing something with that, as it's based on costs here in Yellowknife. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Akasi, member, Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry I didn't make my question more clear to the minister. I'm not asking him to index the minimum wage. The methodology for calculating the minimum wage is something entirely different than calculating the living wage. What I'm asking him to do is index the N.W.T child benefit. Is that possible? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not at this time. As I said, we're in our first year with the N.W.T child benefit. We need to look at the evaluations, look how this has affected our families right across the Northwest Territories. And as I mentioned, any families or individuals that do need that extra support for the basic needs, our government is always there to support and help and provide the most basic needs for our families across the N.W.T, and we'll continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Hale River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you pay attention to the news, it seems like major drug busts have become commonplace in the N.W.T. And despite the hard work of the RCMP, the market here is so robust that there appears to be no shortage of money to be made. So in addition to the social problems that the drug trade brings, it also brings a lot of Southerners, many of whom have ties to gangs and organized crime. So what happens to these people is when they're arrested, they're put into the North Slave Correctional Complex in remand along with the general population. And so why I'm concerned is because what's happening is we're putting a lot of our young, troubled youth, I mean, you know, if you're in your 20s, you're still a youth. You're putting them in a remand unit with hardened criminals and gang members. And correctional centers are proven to be excellent recruiting grounds for gangs. And a lot of these Southerners bring a mentality and a level of violence that isn't traditionally seen in northern correctional centers. So I'd like to ask the minister, because this is a relatively new problem compared to other places, it's not out of control yet, does the Department of Justice have any sort of policy in place to deal with the influx of gangs into the correctional system in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can advise that Corrections is aware of this problem, which the member opposite has alluded to. I can advise that gang awareness is covered for new recruits in the Corrections training program, so staff are aware of the problems involving gangs and are able to identify and deal hopefully with those issues. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, the Kidder member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe I'll look for some more details in a minute, but I'd like to know, does the department do anything to basically get these the gang members out of the territory? Maybe send them back to their home jurisdiction or to a correctional facility that might be better able to handle them. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can advise that those on remand, which would cover many of the gang members that are in the facility, people on remand are held in the jurisdiction in which the offense occurred. Now, once they're sentenced, particularly if they're sentenced to a federal term of incarceration, they are generally sent south. But we can't do that with remands. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadea member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I read the news. I see a lot of these people who are arrested from the south. You know, they're on probation. They have other charges. So, you know, and if they're importing pounds of cocaine and firearms, they're looking at significant time. So what they do is they try to do as much time as they can at North Slave because it's easier time than doing it at Bowden or something. So I guess what has the department done to look into sending them back? I know he says we can't send them out of the jurisdiction, but have they tried? Have they tried anything? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned previously, those alleged gang members would really fall into two categories. Those that are on remand, we don't have the ability to send them back to the jurisdictions from which they came. Also, too, that would be difficult financially. For example, they might have many court appearances, and if they were sent back, say, to Ontario, then we would have to bring them back at our cost each time they appeared in court. However, once they are sentenced, and often they do receive lengthy sentences, many of these gang members are charged with narcotics offenses, and sentences have been increasing in that area. Once they receive a sentence, if it is a federal sentence, that is 2 years or more, my understanding is most of them are sent back to penitentiaries in the south. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is there a way to, I guess when they're identified as having gang affiliation in remand, are they separated from the general population, or are they left with you know, people who are in there maybe just because they have addiction issues? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The staff manage the inmate population based on risk, security, and safety to inmates. So if, in some cases, when inmates, gang members or otherwise, become dangerous, have a security concern, or are dangerous to other inmates, they can be housed outside of the general population in the same facility. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm interested in this topic because it is, I think we're at a point where we can stop this from getting worse like we've seen elsewhere. So I'd ask the minister, would he be able to share the department's policy with me so I can have a look at what they're doing to deal with this gang issue? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will speak with Corrections, and if there is a written policy regarding gang awareness, I will ask them whether they would be prepared to share that with the member opposite. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. The member Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in my statement today, the second largest expense for the family of four in Yellowknife is childcare, amounting to $16,000 a year to provide full-time care for a child and after-school care for another child. So to that end, I want to ask the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, about the recent study of childcare in the N.W.T. that revealed that families had difficulty accessing childcare subsidies. I'm wondering what the minister is doing to make it easier for low-income families to qualify for childcare subsidies. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And any constituents issues that the member is coming by, I encourage you to come and see me at my office, and we can do it on a case-by-case basis. Our government has made improvements to subsidies that we give to all of our daycares throughout the Northwest Territories. We have 11 communities that currently don't have daycare services or access throughout the N.W.T, and that's a focus and a priority to try to get that childcare and daycare services to those 11 communities that currently don't have that. We do have a junior kindergarten program that we've implemented territorially this year, and we're continuing to monitor how that's working out. But any concerns that the member has in terms of families that have approached her or any members in this House, I encourage them to come and see me at my office or send me an email, and we can work on addressing that. Our client service officers also work very hard with our income assistance clients to give them the services that they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to reiterate that the purpose of the living wage is to enable families to earn enough money to stand on their own feet. We hear all the time in this House that the best remedy for a social program is a job. These are people who have jobs, but they're not earning enough money to make ends meet unless they're getting $22.24 an hour in Yellowknife. To that end, how is the minister going to reduce the second largest expense that these families have, which is childcare? What can he do to help working families afford the cost of childcare for their families? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned, we have made changes to our childcare subsidy programs. Myself and the member from Yellowknife Centre actually attended the opening of the new daycare here in Yellowknife, and increased spaces that allowed for more all ages that can access the daycare programs. As I mentioned, we've provided junior kindergarten to 4-year-olds across the territory, which on average saves anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 for families that put their children into the junior kindergarten program. So there's a lot of work that's being done, and we continue to work with our daycares to make sure that they get all the opportunities for the childcare subsidy that's provided to them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tara Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as with many things in the N.W.T, what's required in Yellowknife is not the same thing that's required in Paulatuck. In Yellowknife, we have an affordability question. In other small communities, a third of them in the N.W.T, they have accessibility problems. There are no daycares. So can the minister craft a solution that takes into account the needs of different kinds of communities in providing affordable and accessible childcare? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, and it is a priority of this government to provide early childhood development, childcare as well. And in those 11 communities, and I do agree with the member that what's needed in Paulatuck is not needed the same here in Yellowknife. I think with the junior kindergarten program, we've opened up more spaces here in Yellowknife. The new daycare opening last month was something that was very beneficial to families here in Yellowknife, and we'll continue to work with groups and organizations to get the licensing and make sure that anyone that wants to open up a daycare or childcare spaces, that we work with them to make sure that they have the opportunity to provide those services to our families across the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member, Yellowknife North, Yellowknife Centre, sorry.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday during Committee of the Whole, the minister told us he had signed off an agreement with the federal government on childcare, and he didn't provide any other detail on that. except that there would be money carried over into the next fiscal year. Could the minister please advise us what this agreement says about affordability and accessibility of childcare? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we did sign off on an agreement with the Government of Canada to provide more early childhood programming throughout the Northwest Territories. We're waiting on the signing from the federal government and in order to make sure that the action plan that we're developing through that signing was both agreed to on both parties. We will get information and send that to committee in a letter to give them an update on where we're looking at how we're using those dollars to provide affordable and accessible childcare throughout the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Premier, and they're with regard to the pan-territorial vision on sustainable development and the Arctic policy framework. I don't recall there being any public consultations on the pan-territorial vision. Can the Minister, or can the Premier confirm that for me? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The three Northern Premiers worked together as part of the Northern Premiers Forum to develop this pan-territorial vision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Premier for confirming that there was no public consultation with regard to the development of that statement. And I've had a chance to look at it. There's really, and it's supposed to be about sustainable development. You could actually take the word sustainable out and just replace it with resources. There's nothing in the document really with regard to sustainability. And sustainability is, the classic definition is to make sure that the things that we do today don't take away from opportunities for future generations. It's about intergenerational equity. And the Premier himself has talked about balancing economy and environment. So why is there nothing in the document about sustainability in the pan-territorial vision on sustainable development? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier in response to the member from Yellowknife North question, this was because the premiers, the three Northern Premiers were very concerned about the report of the Ministerial Special Representative of the Minister of Indigenous Affairs Canada. She was commissioned to consult with stakeholders and governments throughout the Arctic, and the terms of reference focused primarily on conservation. When she met with the premiers, we felt that the request for increased sustainable development was not reflected in the report. We felt that significant work had been done in developing conservation and protected areas. We had significant amounts of parks, and the focus of the report that they worked on was marine protected areas. So we felt it was important to have this pan-territorial vision for sustainable development that would help, we felt would balance the report, which was going to be used as the centerpiece for the Arctic policy framework. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Premier for that. I'm certainly more than a bit disappointed to hear that our government has basically rejected the work then that was done by the Ministerial Special Representative. And of course, sustainable development is more than just about resources, it's about people. Things like cultural sustainability, Indigenous language and cultural revitalization, social sustainability, recognizing the roles and contributions of business and civil society. is there going to be some incorporation of these ideas, cultural sustainability, social sustainability, into the N.W.T. chapter of the Arctic Policy Framework? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister and President Obama announced their parallel moratoriums in the Beaufort Sea, the Prime Minister announced that the fact that when we raised it that there was no accompanying economic development strategy to deal with the fact that we were being asked to leave billions or trillions of dollars worth of oil and gas in the ground. There was no accompanying economic development strategy to provide jobs for the people of the Northwest Territories. And he said, well, don't worry about it. We're going to have a clean growth job strategy. We're going to have, you still have tourism, you got fisheries. And so that's what our concern was about. And so we thought the Arctic Policy Framework would be focused entirely on jobs and diversifying our economy. The fact that the member would like to see us include languages, culture, and so on, it was not my understanding of how it would work, but if, as I said, if the roundtables that we will be hosting, where the primary recommendations is that the Arctic Policy Framework should be focused on languages and culture, then we will approach it on that basis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, non dédicace, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Premier for that, of course. And I'm not suggesting that that be the sole and exclusive focus of the document. I want to make sure that sustainability is incorporated into it. It's offered as a genuine input, and I hope that he'll take me up on the offer of including that sort of information and perspectives into the document. It's not just about resource development, and nor should it be. But I have another question for the Minister. Is he committed then to sharing drafts of the chapters it's being put together with regular MLAs and keeping us updated on progress of development of the chapters? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We had a very good discussion at the Intergovernmental Council where all the Aboriginal governments that participated and signed on to devolution. We're very supportive of working together and developing the Arctic Policy Framework. We have committed to holding roundtables throughout the North with all of the different stakeholders, and certainly we will be pleased to share drafts of the documents as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, you can add Canada, the Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is about the time of year the Standing Committee on Government Operations conducts public hearings with statutory officers who serve an ombudsman-like role over the government. So I'd like to take the opportunity today to speak to the Minister of Justice, who's charged with developing ombudsman legislation. Where is this proposal? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that we will be coming forward with legislation later this year. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very eager to see this legislation, but I noticed the budget doesn't have an ombudsman office listed. So how are we paying for the ombudsman role once the legislation is passed? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
We are, of course, committed to the office of an ombudsman, but we have not yet ascertained all of the costs. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, it's clear that Northerners need a one-stop shop for concerns around access to government services, and we need to make sure we have we understand what the costs are going to be on this government to provide that service and support the Ombudsman. So will the Minister commit to getting those facts and figures together and presenting them to either the Standing Committee on Government Operations or to members of the House so we can understand the fiscal implications of this office on this government? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I understand that this is a matter that would go to the Board of Management, so obviously they're going to have to determine what those costs are. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Kasi, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister committed that the legislation is going to come sometime this year. Which sitting of this House will he table the bill for ombudsman? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
I'm not certain at which sitting. We do have quite a ambitious legislative menu that is coming up. Legislation in such areas as cannabis are very important and are very timely. We will, however, are intending to bring forward legislation this year. I can't give you an exact date. Thank you.
Merci. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
See, Monsieur le President, I just need to nail this down. The Premier mentioned that he was prepared to share drafts of the Arctic Policy Framework N.W.T. chapter, but he just didn't go as far as to say that the sharing is going to happen on this side of the House. Can the Minister clearly commit to sharing drafts of this N.W.T. chapter, the Arctic Policy Framework, with regular MLAs? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have committed to sharing all of the draft documents with all of the stakeholders, including obviously the MLAs. I didn't think I had to specifically say it, but that's what I will be doing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, merci. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioners, opening address. Replies to Commissioners, opening address. Replies to Budget address, day 4-7. Replies to Budget address, day 4-7. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of the Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports of the Committee on the Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
This time it's got it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Public Accounts 2016-17, Sections 1 to 4. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Tabling of documents. The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I wish to table the following letter from Gary Vivian, President of the N.W.T. and Nunavut Chamber of Mines, to myself, Premier MacLeod, dated February 12, 2018, commending the Government of the Northwest Territories for sending a strong signal that the Northwest Territories is serious about its minerals industry through its presence at Roundup 2018, along with representatives of Northwest Territories, Indigenous governments that are engaging in their own work to attract mineral investments and jobs to their regions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Tabling of documents. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table the following document, Yellowknife 2017 Living Wage, November 2017, and recommendations based on the Yellowknife Living Wage calculation, November 2017. Merci.
Merci. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Thursday, February the 15th, 2018, I will move the following motion. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on February 15th, 2018, it shall be adjourned until Tuesday, February 20th, 2018. And further, any time prior to February 20th, 2018, if the Speaker is satisfied, after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly, that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, the Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as it has been duly adjourned to that time. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Minister's Statement 1-18 bracket 3. Minister's Statement 19-18 bracket 3. Table Document 63-18 bracket 3. With member for Hay River North in the chair.
Now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the Chair of Committee of the Whole leave the Chair to report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There is a motion to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report, member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering MS 1-18 brackets 3 North Slave Correctional Complex inmate concerns, MS 19-18 brackets 3 Aurora College Foundational Review Process, TD 63-18 brackets 3 Main Estimates 2018-2019. I would like to report progress, and Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
I'll see. Do I have a seconder? Member for Nehende. Motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Wednesday, February 14th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, replies to budget address, day 5 of 7, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in Committee of the Whole, bills and other matters, Minister Statement 1-18.3, Minister Statement 19-18.3, Table Document 63-18.3, Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Merci, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned till Wednesday, February 14, 2018, 1:30 p.m.